Now, I want to welcome everyone to what I know is going to be a really great conversation about a really great film, CinemAbility, The Art of Inclusion. But first, I'd like to do a few thanks and some introductions. So this event just wouldn't have happened if it weren't for the efforts of a lot of good folks. So I want to begin by thanking the FilmSpark crew, which includes Jen, Ben, Kathy, and especially Barry, who made the connection between ASU's commitment to inclusion and this great film, and who just did an outstanding job. Barry did a great job putting this together. I do want to remind everybody to click mute on your microphone as we begin this event. But continuing with the thanks, I want to also thank the Disability Studies program at ASU, our friends at Rancho Los Amigos National Rehabilitation Center, of course, Sidney Poitier New American Film School, including Danielle, who really helped get the word out. And of course, our Hollywood Invades Tempe student crew, Sedona, Gabe, Shalina, Cameron, you guys did a great job helping to put all this together and to promote the event. So now for a few quick introductions, I'd like to begin by introducing Professor Jason Scott, the interim school director and associate professor of the Sidney Poitier New American Film School, and he'll be moderating our conversation tonight. And tonight's panel includes Professor Patrick Bixby, Associate Professor of English and School of Humanities as part of the Arts and Cultural Studies program. And Professor Bixby is part of the Disability Studies program at ASU, and we're just very grateful that Professor Bixby could be with us tonight. I also am very excited to introduce RJ Mitte, whose credits include Breaking Bad. I think I heard somebody when they first came on the Zoom, they said, "Oh, wow, that's the guy from Breaking Bad," which is pretty great. RJ, his credits also include Switched at Birth and the upcoming films, The Oak Room, Triumph, The Oak Room and Triumph, which are both coming out very soon as feature films. Also part of our panel is actor Kurt Yaeger, whose credits include The Good Doctor, Sons of Anarchy, NCIS, New Orleans, and he has an episode of SEAL Team on CBS this coming Wednesday, as well as being a part of season 2 of Another Life, which will be airing this summer on Netflix. And last, but certainly not least, our very special guest, Jenni Gold, the director and producer of tonight's feature film that we're going to be discussing, CinemAbility, The Art of Inclusion. Jenni is also founder of Gold Pictures, a true entrepreneur, with 2 feature films coming out soon, including the Corona Files and the feature film, which is titled Ah Roach! Exclamation mark. And I'm going to let Jenni explain more about that during the conversation. But with that, I will pass it to Professor Scott.
Thank you, Adam. Welcome in, everybody. I know many of you are here from my FMP 250 class, but we also have guests joining us from elsewhere in the university and elsewhere in the universe. And hopefully you've all had a chance to watch the documentary CinemAbility, The Art of Inclusion, which is the subject of what we're talking about tonight. We'll be talking with Jenni a little bit about the making of that documentary, certainly about the impact that it's had since it's come out over the last couple of years. We have RJ and Kurt here to give us the working artist's perspective on many of these issues, and certainly their own lived experience as people with disabilities, how they understand the kinds of issues that we're talking about. And we also have Professor Bixby here to help us have this conversation that also talks about what's happening in our culture as we sort of look at the way that we define ability is shifting very significantly, particularly in the way that we tell stories about disability. I've collected a number of questions from my students prior to this, so I have some of those here. But for those of you who aren't part of the class, or even if you are, if you'd like to put a question in the chat, you can, and then somebody will contact you and follow you up to make sure that we're getting your question right. And we might be able to incorporate that later on in the conversation as well. One of the things that I think the documentary in general just brings up as a subject is what my student Francesca Pirelli asked. and she specifically addressed this to Jenni, but I think it's appropriate for the entire panel. Since we understand and we know that there's a substantial lack of presence of people with disabilities across the industry, do you think this is because people are uncomfortable including or speaking about disabilities, or do you think it's due to their lack of knowledge on the subject? Jenni, what do you think?
I think that it's a little bit of both, a little bit. So you have a lack of knowledge because of experience. Maybe you don't know anybody in your own life with a disability, so you're uncomfortable in that regard. A lot of it is from what we've seen in the media over decades, where we don't have an honest understanding that a person with a disability is just a person with the same likes, desires, and wishes that you have. So all of us are the same. And lastly, it's economical. The producer is going to think it's going to cost more money to have someone on set as a worker, say, or even an actor in front of the camera. So typically, they only use the person with the disability in front of the camera if they have to, because the story is about that. And if in past, I think things are changing, but when they could put someone who was able-bodied in that role, they thought it would be more economical and easier.
Patrick Bixby, I'm wondering if you could sort of give us a little bit of background on this kind of history of discomfort and the idea of disability being something that people don't want to confront in their stories.
Well, Coach, has a long history. If you want to think about it in terms, for instance, provided by Tobin Siebers, who might be familiar to some of the folks in the audience. There's one of the key figures in the emergence of disability studies. He begins really with the Nazi regime in Germany in the 1930s, in the way that certain others to the Nazi race or the German race were singled out for scapegoat status, people with disability being amongst them. And then the aesthetic that grew up within Nazi art, but also within degenerate art, so-called by the Nazis, which viewed variations of human embodiment as a kind of threat, as a reason for extermination, for ill treatment of all sorts. So, when you go to the Nazis, it's bad. Any argument that begins there is going to be an ugly one. But then Siebers traces this all the way through much more contemporary representations in visual arts, but in cinema as well. One of the things that I found so fascinating about Jenni's film was just how comprehensive it was in its scope, going from the very earliest days of silent cinema all the way up to our own era, and tracking the ways that disability has been represented, and not just a limited scope of disabilities, but a kind of comprehensive view of how Hollywood, how cinema in general has dealt with these things. And that's one thing I'd like to explore a bit further, is the sense of a unification of the field of disability, not just being fragmented into a range of identities, but finding some kind of common purpose in Hollywood. And of course, then that spills out into the broader society.
Well, you hit the nail on the head when it says work together, for sure.
Mm-hmm.
I find the biggest thing, and I'm sorry to interrupt, but I think one of our big issues when the disability community is there's so many variables of these different walks of life, and they all can't look at each other and go, oh, they understand me. And that's how it's been, I think, for a while, that people view each other. Because if I have cerebral palsy, you have muscular dystrophy, you're an amputee, we all have something different. You're all part of your own community. And until people like Jenni Gold and Kurt and myself, and like y'all as well, because y'all are doing the program, are able to pull together and show that we're all part of the same growth, that's only very recent.
Yeah. Well, let me ask you, RJ, and you too as well, Kurt. did it affect you not seeing a lot of representation of people with your disability growing up? And how does it feel now to be a role model for people who might share your condition or a similar condition to see themselves? So can you reflect a little bit on how that's just changed for you personally?
Would you like to go, or I can?
It's up to you. You go first?
Yeah, I was very lucky in my community that I grew up with a lot of people that had disabilities. Everything from strokes, severe strokes. My grandfather was in a wheelchair. He could say damn in 1, 2, 3. And that was it. And
that's the only
I grew
important
up,
stuff.
Yeah.
hey, you know how he feels, and he can count money. Done. Well, multiples of 3. So I grew up with that, and I actually understood what he would try to say. And my grandfather was missing fingers, and my grandmother with diabetes, and my Aunt Kitty with polio, and then cancer through the whole family. So I was always dealing with that. So when it came to representation on television, I didn't so much pay attention when I was younger because I had the representation in the home. Mm-hmm. And you know, my closest thing was Forrest Gump. And until I started working in the industry and seeing the statistics and seeing the lack of diversity in film and television, and really it comes down to a monetary factor on that as well. What Jenny was saying earlier about, it's really easier just to go, or in their mind, easier just to go hire a star and make him disabled for the screen, and that's going to pull more money, which in the past worked. But now with media and how we represent each other, there's more of an obligation to the communities to actually have full representation and well-rounded representation. But when growing up, I saw very little. Did it affect me? Not as much as I guess, because I was always around people. So I had role models, not on screen. But it's growing. It's definitely a positive change.
Yeah. I'm interested.
Hey, Kurt, I'm going to jump in.
Go ahead, Jenny.
I'm going to jump in real quick before Kurt. Kurt was a little bit older before he joined our team, but growing up as a young girl and not seeing, you know, other women with disabilities at all, or if it was the, you know, afternoon special that wasn't very special. There were 2 movies that made a huge difference to me, and one was Other Side of the Mountain Part 2, because in that Jill Kinmont Booth ends up getting married and, you know, having a successful relationship. And the second one was ironically a boy in Friday the 13th, because he got, you know, he was messing around with all the other kids, with the girl, and then he got chopped in the face and killed like everyone else. And I thought that was just awesome. So Kurt, you were a little bit older, so tell us how you joined our team.
Yeah, I became an amputee at the age of 29 after I lost my leg in a motorcycle accident, and joined the team that everyone can join very, very quickly. I didn't grow up in a white neighborhood, so me and my friends grew up not seeing people that looked like us. I mean, me, I did, but not a white kid from the wrong side of the tracks. So I never saw that. That didn't make any sense. And then all of my friends didn't see themselves. You know, my friend's dad was going to school to be a doctor. We never saw any of that. So once I became a part of the disabled community, it seemed very akin to the same lack of representation that BIPOC or LGBTQ has. It's just, I didn't even realize how much worse it is. And even when they do include performers with disabilities, the storylines are usually and often inauthentic. So we have a physical, visual representation issue. Then we have a story, cultural, experiential lack of representation as well. So it's sort of a duality issue I think we're dealing with.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And one of the subjects of the documentary is, as Professor Bixby pointed out too, is this history of representation. And one of the things that struck me is, unlike the representation of race, which goes from super stereotyped to super realistic, that Hollywood history is a lot more up and down with how it represents disability. That there are examples from early Hollywood history, sort of in the film The Best Years of Our Lives and Harold Russell is sort of, seen as this sort of watershed moment. But then 50 years later, we have representations that seem to be more reductive and more regressive. So I wonder if, Jenni, this is mostly for you, but certainly everybody can reflect on it. Can you talk a little bit about how we should look at works from previous eras and how we should evaluate them according to their representation, knowing that things were so different then, and how you as a filmmaker would sort of approach the subject of how to talk about each one of these historical films?
So I, as a filmmaker, look at film as art, and I don't like not appreciating art for that time period and looking at it. However, sometimes people want to replay it, and the best movie I can use or remake it when it probably shouldn't be remade would be The Hunchback of Notre Dame. It's been remade recently by Disney. It's been remade a ton of times, and the overall message is not so good for the disabled community, and yet it keeps coming back. I'm happy to appreciate the original works and put them in context for the time that it was made. But I think that as we hopefully learn and evolve, that we shouldn't remake films that have bad representation. It just doesn't make sense. I hope that answers what your question was.
Absolutely. And again, it's, I mean, we're living in this sort of era of quote unquote cancel culture. And as somebody who's a historian, while I want there to be debate and I want people to talk about the meaning of things, the idea of saying we can't even look at it just seems to drive the problem, farther into this.
I think you learn from past mistakes, and if you don't look at them, then you're destined to repeat them. Yeah. And if it is repeated, like in the case of a remake, then hopefully people will point out that that's not current. But I'm all for looking at the old stuff, and appreciating it, but putting it into context for the time and place it was made. And I think that's why I did want so much in CinemAbility. I thought originally that my thesis was going to be that as we evolved as human beings and became more understanding of each other, that we wouldn't have bad representations. And then, movies like $1 Million Baby came out and ruined my whole plan. And then even recently, Me Before You, and it's like it keeps on happening over and over. And I think you kind of hit the nail on the head, where unlike some of the other ones that may have progressively improved other minority group representation, I think this one has had this up and down situation. And I think part of that is because of, filmmakers see other films, but also it's about having people in your personal life, because Miss Susan was a big find. I did not know anything about that film and that situation, and how when she was injured way back when, Hollywood embraced her. She was being groomed to be the next star, and they didn't turn their back on her. They developed a movie for her, and it was a very positive thing back in a time where I would not expect that to happen.
Yeah.
But it did, I think, because the people around her, you know, knew her personally, and it wasn't outside their thinking.
Mhm.
So hopefully this pendulum where we have these bad representations keep popping up will stop. You know, there was even a movie on Hallmark that Teal and I watched and were appalled at recently, not too long ago. But if more conversations like this happen, then hopefully, and especially the filmmakers of tomorrow, it won't be a reoccurring situation.
Yeah.
I might chime in there real quick. I think that's one of the things that this film does so well, again, is to recover these representations that have been forgotten largely. You know, one way to address the past is to point out those moments when the representation of race or sexuality or disability is not in line with our current thinking. But another way to do that is to dig deeper into the archive and to find representations that trouble those stereotypes even in that period. So, I mean, we can go back to the 1920s and 30s to sort of return to the scene I painted a moment ago and find artists who are being persecuted precisely because they're representing First World War veterans who are coming back with disfigured bodies and so forth, and they are not being accepted by the mainstream art community because their subject matter is not being accepted by society at large. But you know, we can go back 100 years later and see these representations and see that people were trying to think differently about what amounted to a beautiful human body, what amounted to a valuable human life. So, you know, there's a lot of work yet to be done there, I think, even within the history of cinema to recover some of those lost representations.
I think now more than ever, we have the opportunity to really help and bring awareness to these types of issues with this device. These being as we are right now, social media, broadcasting, streaming, conversating, the pinnacle of every civilization, the rise and the fall starts with the technology and the informing and the understanding and the knowledge that goes with that. And I think for disability, there is cultural bubbles that we all fit into. And when you're in the cultural bubble, you can't see past the culture. And when you're finally able to see it, your bubble grows bigger. But there's still the bubbles outside this cultural bubble that we just can't comprehend until the bubble expands and we go, oh, that was wrong. Wait, that was not what I was trying to represent. This is what I'm trying to do. But until someone either expands that mentality or provides that, we end up with one side of the fence saying this is art, and the other side of the fence going, this is an art, this is offensive. And I'm very against cancel culture as well. I think that good or bad, we need to learn from our mistakes. I think with Jenni, when she's talking about like some things don't need to be remade. There's a lot of films that made a lot of money that aren't going to do the same. That people think the mentality is like, oh, that made money then, it will make money now. No, it will make a mockery or it will devalue something that we've already stepped forward into our future on. But I think through social media, through technology, through archiving and history and being able to process this in not just a doctoral setting, but as your normal citizen able with a smartphone to go and type in disability and have all this information in front of you, or type in something specific. And now you learn about a whole new thing in an instant. And the difference is too, we have 4-year-olds, 5-year-olds, 6-year-olds with access to this technology that now are being informed as now they are 15, 16, 17-year-olds that are pushing these mentalities of this is what we need representation on that we just didn't have. And we didn't have it we only had it in the last 5 years, really, 10 years. So I believe a bright future is ahead through archiving and information.
Great, thank you. Yeah, and it's sort of it's leading to a couple of questions that I have that are in where the documentary has some gray areas that I think it smartly leaves unanswered. But one of the gray areas, and my student Claire Levitt posted this, you know, there's often discourse in underrepresented communities about whether it's better to have poor representation rather than no representation. what are some of the pitfalls, obviously, of a negative portrayal of disability in our current climate? But I think more importantly, how can we as filmmakers make sure to subvert stereotypes rather than perpetuate them in the stories that we tell?
I mean, I think very simply, it's the equivalent of trying to teach everybody incorrect information like 2 + 2 is 5. What happens when you do a basic arithmetic wrong? Well, everything else goes. So I'm assuming that very much the same with representation, poor storylines, and performers with disabilities not being in front of the camera, representing at least minimally themselves per their own views. It showcases that we're telling stories that don't really fit the American scene. And so it makes people believe falsities about disabilities or any subject, and then those propagate further into the minds of people, and we never get past that original problem. I mean, if you go back to the film Freaks, I mean, everyone was like horribly afraid and everything else. It's like, interesting idea, but the way it's done, has it really improved since the 1932?
32, yeah.
Yeah. Okay, has it really improved all that much? So we've got 80 plus years of issues. So I think that's what it really boils down to. It's not okay when the storylines are told incorrectly or they're the same tropes over and over and over. The trope might be true, but it's not the only truth. So I think that's the other issue, is where's the other part of the truth?
Well, that leads to one of the other gray areas, and there's disagreement in the film about this. And so I'm curious as to everybody's individual perspective, which is probably nuanced, but that's the question about who gets to tell the story and who gets to play those parts. One of the areas—
the guy with the money.
Is that some people think that it's okay for an able-bodied actor to portray somebody with a disability. And now there's a lot of people who are really trying to draw the line and say, no, in order to tell the story the right way, you need somebody who carries that disability with them to play that part. How do you approach that sort of just as a subject in general? Obviously, when you can control it on your own, when it's your decision to make, there's one set of circumstances. But when you see, the variation between a Daniel Day-Lewis and My Left Foot and somebody else who might be less heralded and less acclaimed attempting the same thing, where do we land on that? I know in the movie, Jerry Jewell says, I think it's great. And other people say, oh, no, I'm very upset by it. So how do we navigate that?
My personal belief, it's a double-edged sword. A lot of this you have to remember is all about consumerism. As much as people like to say that this is art, this is also consumer art. So in that mindset, you have to look at it like from producer settings they want the biggest name with the largest pull. And they go, and a lot of the producers are dirty producers that go, hey, we really want a disabled film, but with a big pull so we could rack in the disabled money. And that's a lot of the mentality, and has been the mentality that I've seen in producers. So I'll give you a great example of I actually fought for a disabled role. I was like, look, you can hire me, but this isn't the role you want me to be in. It was a severe disabled character, and I was like, look, I can do this, but this isn't really the role you need for me. Like, I'll be happy to do supporting. They're like, yeah, sure. And I had the role, and I said, here's a list of people. Contact these people. They're the characters you want. And they go, great. I see the movie made with no disability, no representation, and they just hired people. It didn't make it to the light of day, but they just made the movie. They're like, you know what? We don't really need any of them. We just CGI people in. And I was like, cool. And then another example, same scenario. I gave them a list of people. Actually, Kurt was on that list too. I actually think I told you about this like 5 years ago, right? You remember something? I was like, hey, this group, they just canceled the whole film. They're like, you know what? It's not really worth making this film. And they went and made a sci-fi thriller. And like that, because it became down to the money thing. And then it was like, really, we don't really want to deal with representation and disability. It's a little messy. And I'm like, well, these are the films that need to be made. These are the audiences that they're hungry for. And it was like, seems like a headache. I was like, okay, guys. Well, great talking with you, and never talk to them ever again. But there's this weird duality of, do we hire a no name but with heart and representation, or do we hire a name with artificial heart, acting heart, and very little representation? And I think there's a fine line of what you're doing, what you're promoting, and what you're selling. Where you could either bridge that gap, you could use it as an example, a negative example, or you could see positive examples. And I think when we're able to harness that, and we can get more of an equality of positive and negative examples in a setting that we can measure, that's when we're going to see a positive rise above the negatives, because we only hear about the negative. Right now, media wants you to hear about the negative, because negativity buys media. And I find very little when you do positive things and true good. No one wants to hear that. That's great for the community, but come on now, that doesn't sell.
It doesn't have legs. It's a nice, but you can't keep talking about it. You know, the thing with negative stuff is you can extend it into, well, we didn't solve the problem today, so we can talk about it tomorrow. But it tends to evaporate.
They poke the sleeping bear. They go, we want all these angry people to talk about our film. And it's like, no, you don't. You want them to support the film, but until that mentality changes, in which it has, because like a lot of it changed over the last 5 years, and even now, who knows how the industry is going to come back with COVID being kind of a reset button with communication now.
Because of them coming back, money is a concern. Getting things financed is a concern. And I'll let Kurt finish this, but as a producer director, I understand sometimes the hardships that are placed on a producer that needs to get something financed. And I am on the side of, you need to have actors with disabilities represented, especially if you have to use a name actor to get the project made. Then you need to make it up on other roles where these other actors can grow their star power and then be able to fund something themselves. They'll never get there until they have those little roles and can work their way up. But in the meantime, I'm grateful for positive representation, no matter who's in it. Yes, after you've tried, like when Ben Lewin, who's a director with a disability, was doing the sessions, he looked for actors that could play the role. However, it was not going to get financed. And that story would not be told. And it was an important story, important film to be made. So in lieu of that, I would, and Ben knows full well our situation because he's a team member, as it were. But it's important that the projects get made, and that we also understand the issues of producing and how difficult it is. But then the producers, if they're aware of the situation, they'll find a happy medium. And I think Kurt.
Yeah, I think that it's a nuanced perspective between idealism and pragmatism. Idealism is everyone should be able to play any role and be auditioning, and the best actor wins. Pragmatically, they're not auditioning performers with disabilities for roles. I would love to say they are or whatnot, but unless it says disabled, or it says CP, or it says amputee, or it says wheelchair user, you're not going to audition for the majority of the roles. Now, that doesn't mean that holds true in every single situation, because there's always outliers. And even when a character with a disability is written, if it's too big, then a disabled person can't play it for the financial reasons that were discussed here.
Yeah.
So if you can never get a leading role as a regular actor and you can only play disabled roles that are low, how will you ever become an actor of note to carry a film? So the idealism is being squashed by the pragmatism of the day. And the concept is, may the best person win in an audition, but they're not basically allowing performers with disabilities to even audition. And if you replace the word audition with the phrase send in your resume, I think it hits a little bit differently. They're basically saying, don't apply. We don't want you.
Yeah.
I've been in rooms in the writer's room where they're like, oh, wouldn't it be cool if this leading actress, we you know, let's put her in a wheelchair. And they're like, yeah, but we're not going to audition characters or actors with disabilities for those roles. I've been in those conversations. I've been in the rooms. I'm no RJ has. I know Jenni has. So there, it's not even that being a question. When you mentioned Jerry Jewell, she's, you know, was on Facts of Life and was one of like the show's hits. You know, she was on Deadwood and she was awesome. And she says, you know, in 30 years of being a film professional, I've had 30 auditions. Why?
Yeah, I do want to clarify something for her, because in the film, she didn't want people to think that she thought any actor should that it was okay for able-bodied actors to play disabled characters. She said, and to me, to clarify it for her, was that if disabled actors are able to apply for every other role, then able-bodied actors could also. But right now, it's not fair. If it was fair, and like Kurt was saying, anybody would be auditioned for every role, the teacher, the doctor, the star, the recurring character, then sure, best actor for that role wins. But it's not like that right now.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, when you have like Marlee Matlin, who's literally won an Oscar, why isn't she a superstar? People who win Oscars are superstars, right? They make money on them, bank on them, everything else, but she's not. Now she's up for a second one. Is this going to be the one that launches her career? Or the, you know, Zach from Peanut Butter Falcon? Why is he not on a new show? And everything? Why is RJ not the lead of a new show? He's already proved his worth. Everyone who is on that hit show has gone on to other stuff. Where's the quintessential issue?
Yeah.
It's not rocket science to look at the obvious.
Yeah.
I'll tell you the biggest issue is politics.
Politics, baby.
Politics.
Yeah. Well, and I appreciate the correction, Jenni, on Jerry Jewell's perspective. It's important to have that full context. Let me just explain a little bit for the students, because we're talking about something we haven't quite labeled it. When you make a film, you have to get an insurance bond or a completion that's going to guarantee the completion of the film. And that insurance company is going to look at all of the risk factors to make sure that your film will be completed. So when you're dealing with anybody on any key person, somebody on camera or your director off camera, if it's somebody who has a physical condition that could potentially interrupt the filming or disrupt the filming, it becomes a problem. You see this happen with some directors who are older, in their 80s. They actually have to have like a second person on the set just in case they have a medical episode. So this isn't pointed towards people with disabilities, but it indirectly affects people with disabilities. I can give you a quick example of another way that this works that might help you put it in your mind. Once upon a time, Robert Downey Jr. was uninsurable because of his drug problem and his personal demons that were very public. That, you know, he was arrested in public. He went to jail. And when he got out of jail, he could not find work. Nobody would insure him because they thought for sure he would have some drug episode, an overdose, or production stop. It took Mel Gibson as a producer to say, I will put up the money so that Robert Downey Jr. can do a film called The Singing Detective, where he plays somebody with a very horrible visible skin condition. It's a weird musical, very strange project, very strange thing. And Robert is great in it. And he's literally playing a disabled person who has to, you know, reckon with his disability. But it was only because Mel Gibson said, I will put up the $8 million necessary to make that happen. And from there, he got another film, and from there, he got another film, and a year later, he was Iron Man. You know, but the industry could have stopped that, could have stopped his career if Mel Gibson of all people, didn't step forward and say, I have to go around that system, or else this actor will never be able to work again.
But
And there's a lot of you hit a nerve, apparently. I was going to say there's a lot of because of the way people think of people with disabilities, there's a lot of assumption that someone with a disability can't perform or would get sick or whatever, because that's what we've seen in the movies, right? They're the person in the hospital. They're never the person on a BMX bike. They're, you know, when I directed Roach, you know, I first there was a cold going around the set, and you know, we all got sick, and we kept showing up for, you know, the directors were working, you know, 18-hour days. It wasn't a problem. You just push through because you do. Someone said, oh, you know, someone with a wheelchair, they're going to get tired on set. And I'm like, what are they talking about? I'm sitting down. You know, I get to say, I don't have to do any energy at all. You know, it's easy. It's a perception problem. And I think, Kurt, you've got a funny story about being on the beach with somebody, right?
Yeah, I was cast as a able-bodied actor in a role, you know, as the character's main episode's bad guy in Lethal Weapon. And I did 6 days of filming, and on the 7th day we were riding motorcycles down the beach, which if anyone rides motorcycles, you know how hard it is to do it on the beach anyways. But I was a professional athlete. I rode 2 wheels for a living. And even with one leg, I can do backflips over bikes or jumps right now. So they didn't even know I was an amputee, but it was like 110 degrees out that 7th day, and cameras stopped working. The PAs were like pouring water on their back. They can't even handle it. And so we were taking breaks. And one time I took down my pants and poured out my prosthetic leg from all that sweat. And everybody was like, oh my gosh, he's an amputee. What do we do? He's disabled. Can I get you anything? What do I need? And it instantaneously turned to fear and let me try to help you. And oh my gosh. And I'm like, did you not just see me riding motorcycles down the beach? Like, we're cool here. So, you know, if the equivalent of being disabled is being a drug addict, jailed performer, that's pretty brutal. But you did bring up the solution. It is to bypass the system and have major champions who will back it with their money.
Right.
Yeah.
That's the point.
Which is why that's the only way as a female director, everything I've done has been because I found the financing myself. I haven't been hired outside of finding the project, finding the money, and hiring myself. Out of film school, I realized I wasn't going to get hired. And even when I go to minority events at the DGA, you know, like Carl Weathers is there. I mean, he was Apollo Creed. He's going to get hired as a director before me, you know, and he's famous, you know. So I'm like, wow, I got to find a different route. So my route was finding the material, writing, and then finding the money.
Yeah.
That's because I can't get hired because no one else, you know, will, which is hopefully going to change. So far, not.
Jenny and I, and even RJ and a bunch of people have talked about it. We've talked about getting to kingmakers and having a few kingmakers literally make us superstars, so that then we can go back and be in all of Jenny's projects and get them all instantaneously funded. Like, we're all working together to make the same thing, but it's
which you bring up a sore subject for you two guys, but 2 of your friends and 2 of our other friends were in my last film, Roach. Roach is about a, you know, college campus attacked by killer cockroaches, but I still made room for the dean to be David Hall from CSI. And Toby Forrest had a part, and it wasn't, surprise, surprise. Oh, and then also Zach had a part, but it wasn't about their disability. It was just, they were college students and a dean. And it was helpful that Zach is an amputee because the roaches bit off his arm, but that was just a bonus, and shows how you can work it into any project if you have the heart to do it. I think in CinemAbility, I think it was Bill Macy that says it's just that people have to think about it. They haven't been, woke about, people with disabilities are people, and they represent 20% of the population. And if they're 20% of the population, they should be in the films.
Yeah, and even the sense of I know, and Patrick, you might be able to lend some perspective here too. Is there's sort of this idea in disability studies that disability is actually our default state as humans, that we are actually, some of us are temporarily abled, but our natural state is a state of disability because our bodies are fragile. And most of us at some point in time or another will carry some kind of disability with us. So there's much more potential for us to identify with these characters than maybe we want to acknowledge as a culture.
Well, and that might be some of the source of discomfort for some audiences as well. Yeah, I mean, if we live long enough, we're all going to end up disabled. That's the bargain we've entered into. And the numbers are interesting here. So you mentioned between 20 and 25% of the US population is disabled, but representation in film cinema just doesn't get anywhere near that. And the sort of systemic problems that you all have been describing extend out into the broader society as well. So disabled people face about 70% unemployment compared to 4 or 5% in a good economy for able-bodied folks. So but that suggests, I think, and this is one of the things that I think the film does really well too, is that Hollywood of all places might be the place to start fixing this, right? If you need to change people's minds to begin to push back against this systemic discrimination, which is very much akin to systemic racism in many ways.
Patrick,
but what's the move you get? How do you do that? And I think this idea of finding the right benefactor who can kind of flip the switch and make things happen, and then that begins this kind of ripple effect that hopefully spills through the media industries, but also out into the world at large.
Patrick, you always keep hitting things right on the nail, right on the head, which is wonderful. Because one thing that we've realized, and hopefully the public will realize, is that people with disabilities are great employees, as opposed to how Kurt said that if we're compared to the actors compared to the worst possible actor on set, in fact, we're the best possible. Why? Because we overcome challenges. And in any work environment, if you can overcome a challenge, you're successful. And people with disabilities have this, whether they've grown up with their disability, like RJ and I, or acquired it later in life, like Kurt, you learn to adapt, adjust, and overcome. And what greater skills for an employee of any sort.
And that's precisely the message that needs to circulate broadly, right? And that's one of the things that I think is really important about this project, is that it highlights the role that media, that Hollywood can play in the transformation. If Hollywood has played this role for so long of elevating certain images of beauty, certain images of able-bodiedness, certain values regarding disability, then it can be the solution as well. And I think RJ mentioned this, that the last 5 years or so, there is a turn towards a more inclusive and accepting embrace within that environment. But I also wondered, and this is something that RJ touched on too, if the end route, if the way to get around this isn't smaller productions that find their way to people through YouTube or other social media and so forth, that don't have to rely on the big money and they can begin to change minds and get attention and even appeal to the power brokers in Hollywood by finding other means to get on screen.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I've agreed with everything that everyone said here. I think one of the things that you just touched on is that every person in this world at some point or another will have some form of disability. I think one issue that we also forget, that we don't like our own mortality. The human species has never liked the thought of death or the thought of being weak or not being able to prevail. Stories, if you look at the history of storytelling, it started with Rome and the Gypsies and all these people of triumphant stories of these pubs of victory, of conquest, and it just evolved to the theater of telling Caesar Augustus and his court of arts and all these aspects of art that have just been compiled to really like infect people's minds, infect people's minds of grandeur and glory, and allow them to believe in storytelling and things when people were dying around them and when they didn't have access. For a long time, disability, and even now, disability is viewed as a weakness, as an illness, as something that we have to always overcome, that we have to cure, that we're living with, and it's a burden. That's all a lie. That's a perception, but that's not a fact. To me, I believe disability is an opportunity and it's knowledge. And that's something that we need in the human species to understand what our bodies are capable of. And the thing is we use so little of our mind and body in the physical capacity that we have and are able to do. As Kurt said earlier, that dude's got a half pipe. You have a half pipe in your backyard, right? Yeah. Like, this dude goes vertical. He pulls 0 G's all the time. Like people don't get that just because you're facing something or you have this, what people see you as, oh, you got to be careful with that guy. He's fragile. And same with me. I am more durable than your average human body because of my cerebral palsy, because of the broken bones, because of the dexterity in my muscles are always tight. My muscles are stronger than my bones. And so I ride, I fall, I go down mountains and all kinds of stuff and crash. And like, yeah, it's probably not the best thing for me, but I get back up and I keep going. And when people and your average individual sees disability, they see, oh, that person is kid gloves, and that's our own mortality, and we're afraid to see that. And with the media now, we can show positive that this isn't a mortality. Just because you may have something isn't a death sentence. When kids and babies are born with cerebral palsy or Down syndrome, a lot of times in most countries they ask to euthanize. Like that's the thing. It's like, are you sure you want to keep this thing? Because it still doesn't have to be a human. Like it's
well, I mean, even in America recently with the COVID stuff, there was a whole discussion about doctors determining quality of life. And if the doctors think someone with a disability doesn't have a great quality of life, like these two guys are crazy. They're doing all kinds of stuff. I know their quality of life is pretty damn good, but I wouldn't want some doctor looking at them or me and going, yeah, I don't think they need the treatment. And recently the film is going global now because of the American Film Showcase, which is part of the US State Department. And they had me do one of these Zooms, looks like we're doing now, with in Prague the other day. So it was virtually in Prague. And I was telling Kurt that one of the people afterwards was like, oh, it's so great to hear from you because, I remember I've been here for 50 years and, the communists, they would put all the disabled people away. And there was this place, this hospital, and we never saw them. They never came outside. And I'm like, you're freaking me out. I know this stuff is true. And I know that's why I'm here. So I had to kind of bite my tongue and go, yeah, I'm glad, hopefully things are changing. But as advanced as we are in America, there's still a long way to go. Imagine other, third world countries and certain cultures. Our good friend, Angela Rockwood, who was one of the Push Girls, who, did a tremendous job representing, she speaks on behalf of the Christopher and Dana Reeve Foundation for the Asian community that still, kind of feels uncomfortable about disability in Great numbers. So they've been doing their part. And I think as the other thing that we've all been talking, Kurt and RJ and I have been talking about, is that as we do events like this and support each other, and then hopefully find those other champions that can join forces with us, we can pave the way for others. I remember when I first took a radio television class at University of Central Florida, there was no ramp. The RTV room was built up for the cabling underneath. So they had to build a ramp for me. Nobody else, thought of doing it because, unfortunately, the arts aren't encouraged for people with disabilities. They don't go, yeah, you can be a director. The first professor I talked to said, your odds as a female director are abysmal, and you use a wheelchair, so it's going to be impossible. And I said, basically, screw you, I'm going to do it anyways. And then he said, I'm just kidding. He would basically test everybody, find their weakness, and see if they would give up, because he knew that this business is tough, and there are a lot of hurdles for anyone. But hopefully with discussions like this, we can educate future filmmakers, and hopefully there'll be employers who will employ people with disabilities, both in front of and behind the camera, without allowing themselves to be biased as to the capabilities of somebody else.
Yeah. Well, let me. I've got a question from Ava, who's in the chat here, and I'm going to combine it with a question of mine, and that's just to ask you about when you get on a new job or when you get on a new gig, what are you looking for in terms of the production, in terms of knowing that you're going to be in a space that works for you? Have you ever had to advocate for your character to explain the disability or explain what's going on or offer your perspective? How do you negotiate and find power on a set? And what are the things that the filmmakers can do to make sure that when they're working with, whether it's people with disability or just people who are different, that they feel included? What are some of the things that you like to see on a set that make you know that you're in a good place?
Craft services and a toilet.
Which,
and a medic.
Yeah, well, and the thing is, and we were talking about this a little bit when we came in, but when you accommodate for whoever, whether it's this group or that group, you're actually accommodating for everybody. And you're not the only one who needs a toilet. Everybody needs a toilet. It should be a workable, safe toilet that is accessible, not, oh, go behind the tree, but what do we do about the person who's in the wheelchair? It's like, well, no, everybody should have a toilet. So we're talking almost about basic accommodations, but I'm just curious as to what are some of the other things that you, when you get on a set, that you would want to ask for, claim, or discuss?
I think that's the greatest point, though, is right now, if you go to any set that's on location, 0 of the trailers are going to be ADA compliant and accessible. 0. I'm not suggesting it's maybe none. I'm saying it's 0. End of story. So you have a lawsuit up the wazoo for every single production in every studio in every network right now. Period. End of story. And every single one of my friends who have been on sets as a writer, director, producer, or performer have been like, I didn't have a trailer. I didn't have accommodations. They had to drive me over to another location. They rented the house next door, so I had a place to go, etc. ad nauseum. So you can start right there. They don't care. It's an afterthought. So if it's an afterthought in terms of physical accommodations, it's an afterthought in the story. So they should think about it when it starts in the story and the writer's room. Before that or after that, it's an afterthought and you're shoehorned in. And that's the biggest problem ultimately.
And you're afraid to do anything. So like, there's a big thing of if like he said, there's a lawsuit there, but if everyone attaches to that lawsuit, none of you will be ever working again. That's practically like also part of that. There's a good chance that they will like be like, yo, there's the list, put them on the black. And it happens.
Hell yeah.
You talk about Mel Gibson. Mel Gibson can't make movies in Los Angeles. Like he literally can't. Like he can't do anything in California. And he literally traded places with Robert Downey Jr. He signed over his role in literally, it's practically the same time that Robert Downey Jr. came back into Hollywood is when Mel Gibson got thrown out of Hollywood.
Yeah.
And like, you want to get it in your agent. So this is for the actors listening. Before you sign on to the project, know your accommodations, know what you need to be able to work and say, look, like for me, I need very little, but I work with individuals with disabilities. I work with, and Kurt knows, and Jenni knows, a man named, oh my God.
Good old, what's his face?
Travolta, who has inclusion films. Not John, but his Joey Travolta. Me and Joey shot a film about 2 years ago that came out called Carol the Bells. Our goal in shooting this was to prove we had a 75% disabled cast and crew. Like, and even the able-bodied people that we had, they technically really weren't able-bodied, but they were deemed able-bodied. So like, and we had no issues. Our accommodations were very little, but we still had the accessibility aspect.
You know, I will say there are some studios that are, you know, and some people that are very aware and accommodating. I remember when I first came out here and was posting my first feature at a sound, you know, we got approved to do it at Universal in a sound facility for the mix. And we looked at it the day before, my husband and I, and it was up like 4 stairs. And we were staying in a hotel. We didn't even live here yet. We just come out to finish the film. And I was like, shit, what are we gonna do? So we're like, okay, well, we're just planning the next day. We're like, we'll go to Home Depot, we'll buy some wood, we'll figure it out, because, you know, we had gotten this great deal and we didn't want to jeopardize it by being a troublemaker. And then I get a call from them going, hey, we'd like you to come out and check out the ramp. They had the studio, they built a ramp. And then next time I got a bigger film and a bigger sound stage, they built another one. So it's like I don't know if they kept them, hopefully they did. But everywhere I go, I was making it accessible. And now I'm sort of like, if a facility, and I'm talking primarily in post right now, isn't accessible for a DI house or a mixing stage, I don't use them, you know, and that's, again, about the economics of it. You know, hopefully there'll be more, but RJ hit on it. A lot of people don't want to. If it's an actor, we've all talked to the actors that, you know, they didn't want to say anything, you know, because they were afraid of making waves. I know that Marley has talked about how, you know, people like, you know, she's like, I do read lips, but I do need an interpreter. And, you know, it's an accommodation that she has to have.
Yeah.
So those kind of things, producers get a little, you know, tight about because they're worrying about the cost. But it's minor in the reward. They're just not thinking it through.
Well, I mean, if you think about like accommodations, like from a wardrobe or bathroom, that's just law. That's just the price of doing business in a first world country, period. But when you think about like sets and making them accommodating, they already do it for all the dollies and everything else. So they're not making ingenious new things. They push all the heavy equipment around, Video Village. You know.
I have that
Kurt,
conversation.
you're assuming this is a
everybody,
first world country.
I have that conversation a lot. It's like, well, will you be able to get over the cables? I'm like, I'm a lot smaller than a dolly. I go 12 miles an hour and I've never had trouble on a set. You know, and plus there's video assist. I mean, these are just, again, misconceptions that people have because they've never seen it before.
Yeah,
you know, when I was on set, it's not only about, I'm sorry guys, I know you're both guys, but when I was on set my last film, at one point, I gave a direction to some guy and he was like, yes, yes, sir. And I was like, apparently there's not enough women directors. And immediately he goes, yes, ma'am. And everyone just broke out laughing. And it was funny. It's like, if you don't see it, Gina Davis says the thing,
Yeah.
if I can see it, I can be it.
Yeah,
And
I mean, all the stories you're talking about are, with disabilities are all about characters who just have to overcome and fight to do the most basic things. And if they became disabled, they can get just this much of their life back and they're so happy. And so the idea of that over and over and over is that, shit, I don't want that on my set. Like that seems like a giant pain in the ass.
Yeah.
And yet I run up the Empire State Building in 20 minutes and 19 seconds for charity. I run 5 miles every single day. I'm more athletic than everybody here. But like RJ's saying, like he's busting his ass twice as much as anybody else. And so is Jenni. We're the people you want to give your money to make a project. We're going to do it right because we understand how hard it was to get here. So yeah. it's the inverse. They actually are not, they're totally confused by it.
I've got,
I think what we need is people like everybody listening here that see the film, see, what it's talking about, that listen to this kind of conversation, and then remember that old commercial, and then they tell 10 friends, and they tell 10 friends, and so on.
Well, it's actually a question I want to get to. And before I go on too much farther, I just want to tell the people in my class, we've sent you a link for a form to fill out for your attendance. So that will be posted on Canvas. Details to take care of. Please be sure you just to fill that out, check that you were here so we can get you attendance wise. But we do have a guest, Michael Scott, no relation, who has a question. Michael, can you come on and introduce yourself, please?
Hi, can you hear me okay?
Yes, great.
Oh, great. Hi, everyone. Yeah, I'm Michael Scott. I'm a physician. I work at Rancho Los Amigos National Rehab Hospital. So we're a hospital that specializes in providing care for people with disabilities, and primarily people with acute injuries, so spinal cord injuries, traumatic brain injuries, or neurological disabilities such as stroke. So yeah, very, very great discussion. I saw the film last night and really enjoyed it, and really great to highlight this issue because part of what we do is help our patients find a path forward after they sustain a life-changing injury or disability, and how to integrate back into life and find a new path forward. And some of them may never consider going into film or the movie industry, and I think that's important to let folks know that that's definitely a possibility. And I posed a question on the chat. What's the industry doing to really actively create a pool of talent, both in front of the camera and behind the camera, so that you actually have people who can tell authentic stories about living with a disability, and how do we develop that pool and that pipeline? Is the responsibility lie with film schools, or I don't know the industry at all, so I'm just posing that question to the group. What your thoughts are on that?
Well, we have a large network. Sorry, Jenni.
One thing, as far as behind the camera, professionally, and studios aren't doing anything to promote it at all. Corporate America, even in employment, wasn't doing anything at all until, again, maybe the last 5 years, where they started including disability as one of the minority groups when they would have special groups. But in Hollywood, there's nothing behind the camera. In front of the camera, there's always been, since I first came out here, the Media Access Office, which was always pushing for more opportunities for actors with disabilities. But a lot of it's been up to themselves to fight it. And I told you how the film school was when I was in there. I won't tell you what year that was, but hopefully, there'll be more professors that will encourage people in front of and behind the camera. And the one other big difference is YouTube and the cameras. When I shot my first feature, it was 35 millimeter. I had to have a crew of 50. It wasn't something I could do on my iPhone. But now the access is, they've lowered the bar and made it a lot easier for people to showcase their talents. And I'll throw it back to you, RJ.
No, I mean, there's a lot of communities. I really recommend to everyone watching, find your local community, wherever you're from. I know probably a lot of you are in the same area. Find those peers, find those groups, talk with them, create films. Everything that you see on television, in movies, yeah, it's like big network, blah, 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 but really it's one person with a vision and that can share that vision. And if that filmmakers hear that breaks that barrier of how people view whatever that may be, that's part of that course. That's that ship that's going to take everyone to the promised land. And like, cause it just broke that one wall, and the wall that we're facing is a big wall, but it's also a very fragile wall, and it will accept people if it's so chosen to be that piece of that art, that pinnacle art. And that's not up to any one person. That's a dream, and that's a hope. You create this thing, you let the masses have it, and you hope that it's read properly and it's received properly and you did it properly. And that goes to you, the individual filmmakers.
Well, hopefully the talent will also rise. The cream goes to the top and all that.
Yeah.
Not everybody is cut out for everything, but if you have the opportunity and do the training that's necessary, you can give it a shot.
Yeah. Hey, Michael, this is Kurt. I mean, I'm an entrepreneurial disabled actor performer, right? And so I've been in 58 episodes of television, 15, 16 films, 60, 70 commercials. I produce my own content. You got a lot of doctor friends. Let's raise some money and go make our own shit. Come on.
Hey, I like how he thinks.
Right? Let's get 50 doctors together. Each pitch in 30 grand. It's a tax write-off, section 181 of the tax code. Boom. Now we go make our own stuff.
Yeah, I'm a doctor at a public hospital. We don't make it.
Yeah, you're talking to the wrong doctor.
But I do like how you think. Like how you think.
Well, so and in fact, our next question is from Kevin Kanawati, who is asking sort of the opposite question, which is about what big studios can do. Kevin, if you want to come on, you can unmute yourself.
Yes. Sorry, big fan, so I'm a little nervous. But I was going to say, do you guys think like companies or studios such as like Disney and Warner Brothers will be more open to include people with disabilities in grand films, like any kind of like Marvel or DC films? Like, I know they've been expanding in their lead roles of people in color, such as in like Black Panther or Miss Marvel, and female leads like in Wonder Woman and Black Widow. Like, can you guys see a superhero lead in the future being someone like of disabilities, such like a cyborg film or a good Daredevil film or Punk or Captain Marvel Jr.? Like anything that would like represent and show that they could also, just because you have a disability doesn't mean you cannot be a hero.
Well, those entities actually have departments that solely focus on this. And really it's all about the kick and what people are buying, because right now it's been really big into persons of color and women leads. So they know that's what the general audience wants, and that's what they're trying to push more for. So when disability finally gets that turn in that quota of diversity mark, of that diversity checklist, we will see that. But it might take time, or it could be tomorrow. But when it comes to us as working actors and producers on this level, they don't really look to us. They kind of just do it and go, this is what we want. You go get me that. And that's kind of the mentality that a lot of the big entities have. But they do have diversity casting groups or diversity testing groups inside the organization. But those aren't to benefit the diversity. Those are to capitalize on the diversity. And that's artificial diversity.
They don't understand yet that the annual disposable income of the disabled community is greater than the tween income, which is the
$2.5 billion. That was
Yep.
the estimated value. 2.2 to 2.5 billion dollars
greater
of
than
disposable income.
greater than the tween market, which Hollywood goes after desperately.
And
There must be
disability-
thousands and billions of twins. If they all see our movie, that's insane. Yeah.
Diagnosed disability is 15% representation of our globe. So 15% of the globe that has registered disability, because a lot of people aren't registered disabled. I'm not actually even registered disabled because I don't qualify.
Well, in the DGA, there are only 2 people with disabilities that are visible. Ben Lewin, who I spoke of, who walks with Canadian crutches, and myself in a wheelchair. And there may be others that have hearing loss or maybe bipolar or, something else, but they don't want to admit it because they know they won't get hired. And that's unfortunate. But as far as the question, as far as Marvel, I think, Kurt would make a good superhero, and there you go.
I have another question from
Ghost Rider.
Yeah, from my student Gustavo. What are some other genres that you would like to see performers with disabilities in that maybe hasn't been done before? What's RJ, Kurt? What are your dream roles to play?
Dream roles. RJ's older brother.
All right, so there's a concept.
Brother.
There's the first
more
film.
handsome brother.
Yeah. Lady killer right there.
Yeah, it's a lot of acting that'll take. No, I mean, look, I feel like I'm just starting to do some of the stuff I want to do, and in the show Another Life, the showrunner Aaron Martin is awesome and just let me add in content to what he was making. And I said, listen, people with disabilities, one thing that has never really been shown is anyone who's sexualized. They're always asexual. They never, like, all female friends of mine who are wheelchair users, like, they never let me be the sexy girl. I'm always the cute friend who maybe gets a kiss on the cheek. Woo! And they're, 30-year-old women with all the same needs and desires that any other 30-year-old woman wants. Same thing with the guys. So from my perspective with Another Life, I said, listen, I'm going to put my body into the shape that, I don't know what the right word.
That we want to see.
Desirable,
appealing.
Yes.
Hubba hubba is what we're looking for.
Yeah, the hubba hubba. That's the scientific term. And I put my body into that shape, and did a lot of work to get to it for like 4 months. And then they were filming it, and they're like, "Holy shit! Like, this has never been done before." So more stuff like that on a larger scale would be awesome. And more leading characters instead of the accoutrement characters, the shoehorn, the side. A lot of characters I play, even if they're, in 8 or 10 of the episodes of a series, it qualifies someone else's perceived military experience, because the guy with one leg who looks military must have been military visually. So it helps the audience get through it. But instead of those characters, when you get to a lead character, the people I want to play are more nuanced. It's the struggles, it's the highs, it's the lows. It's the negatives of my particular disability, but then it's the positives. It's my perspectual shift, my empathy gain, my value systems changed. When I went through my accident, I learned who my family was. I learned who my friends were and weren't. Like, that helped give me a zest for life that I didn't have beforehand. And it's weird, but I would not take it back for anything, period. End of story. So that character has never been explored, and it's because most writers write what they know, and most writers aren't disabled. Therein lies the problem. You got 12, 15 WGA writers who are open about having a disability, and there's 600, 700 TV shows with 3 to 7 writers in each room, which means they make up 7 times. So that's 4,300. So they make up 12 of 4,300. What percentage is that?
Not a lot. Yeah.
Yeah. It's ridiculous.
I
0.3.
go ahead.
Yeah, point three.
Yeah, was this 0.3 or 0.03? I'm not sure, but thank
so
you.
How is RJ or me gonna get a role written for us?
Yeah.
If that's not even there, and even when we do, it's like the buddy, the friend, the guy who comes in, right?
Yo,
Yeah.
I just want the commas. 3
Well,
commas. That's all I want.
3 commas. Yeah. Well, RJ, you're actually. This is. I want to wrap up, but I want to give you a chance to talk about the film that you made, Triumph, because you had a little bit of hand in that, and also talking about what that film is doing in terms of raising money and for charity and stuff like that. So.
So Triumph is a story about a high school wrestler who had cerebral palsy in the 80s, and he really wants to wrestle, but people in the 80s view him as disabled, of course, because he's this weird disabled kid who can't really walk or has a slur, and they're like, again, the 80s. People didn't have the view of him. He was this kid that kind of got picked on and bullied. And the writer named Michael Coffey, this is kind of his memoirs and what he wished would have happened to him in high school. He wrestled, but he never got the chance to actually wrestle. And he's late 40s, early 50s now. Yeah, high school in the 80s. And this kind of story it embodied what he wished he could achieve, but he just didn't get the opportunity because of people's perception of him being fragile. And so it's this journey of this kid going through bullying and trying to wrestle, and people still viewing him as fragile, and meeting a girl, and that kind of, someone mentioned when they were talking about Glee and Me Before You on having girlfriends or the dude in the wheelchair. They weren't really disabled people though. That's the difference. They don't give me and Kurt the sexy role because we actually are disabled. They give that person that they're going to put in the wheelchair the hot girlfriend. But that doesn't always work out in the long run. But when it talks about the harsh of filmmaking, Triumph was one of those passion films where we actually had to pull out bankruptcy. I had to go get funding for it. I had to fight for it. We had people stealing the money from it, and the guy who was stealing the money was using the disability mark to try to steal money from it, and using that because he thought he could do that because everyone was disabled on the producer side, right? So he knows that he could get away with it, and he did it to a bunch of films. So we pulled that film up by the bootstraps. We filmed the rest of it. We made it, and part of that pulling it up by the bootstraps was how can we get back to the community? How can we create this film that's focusing on diversity and inclusion and trying to hit all the notes on what we want to see of this type of character. And part of that was we partnered with United Cerebral Palsy, and we actually gave them points on the back end of this film. And we have a couple other organizations that we link to it. But I until this day have never seen a film actually give points of that film to a charity. And why I think this is important in the sense of this role. And I don't recommend you don't just hand out points. That's not a thing that you do. But for me, what I think is, if you have a film that you're passionate about or something there that already has the community there that you're wanting to support, I think being able to provide funding in any type of manner is key to that, as every organization, every entity needs money to survive. So we link that to them. So initially when this film comes out, someone posted, thanks Jason, the trailer to it. But if you're wanting to support organizations, donate time, your personal time, your money, and if you want to do it, and resources. And that was the key, is how can we support an organization, not just one day, but in perpetuity to the future of this film and to the future of what we're trying to face. And we came up with, let's give these guys points, and hopefully it makes a bunch of money and everyone gets paid, and they have quite a few points on the back end, so they're going to be doing very well.
Great.
And it's that organization. Sorry, just so y'all know, the organization, please. United Cerebral Palsy, is actually it has schools. It's based in Central Florida, but there's 9 schools all over the country, focusing on with individuals with disabilities, but not just cerebral palsy, but it's called UCP.
Mm-hmm. Great, yeah, and what I'm taking away from this conversation is that, there's ways that we've seen change happen historically, but it's always had to happen within the confines of this very rigorous, very controlled, very profit-motivated industry. But when we're living in a time now where, because more people are capable of telling their stories through new technology, through raising money themselves, through going around that system, that's probably where we're going to see that next wave of impact that these stories can make. One of the things that CinemAbility really highlighted for me that I'd sort of forgotten about was that the presence of these stories, particularly by Vietnam veterans in the 1970s and 80s, but other disabled people as well, really did lead to the American with Disabilities Act, that the cultural visibility of disabled people became the calling cry for actual sort of, social change beyond just storytelling. So I'm hoping that whether it's the filmmakers and the professionals we have with us today, or my students in the room, or a combination of all of us, we can find those new pathways, those new ways of making things that accommodate everybody so that they can be part of the process in whatever role. Certainly empower the storytellers, whether they're disabled or not, to feel comfortable telling those stories. And then finally, just again, bringing the performers, the directors, the writers who are disabled forward and showcasing their entire range of talents. We had a great question that I didn't get to about disabled people being stunt performers, or other places that, whatever their physical condition, whatever their mental condition, it's actually an asset in the filmmaking process. And you've also spoken about that as well. Any final words from our guests? Any thoughts that you'd like to leave our students with as we wrap up here?
Thank you. I hope y'all enjoyed, and y'all are the class that's going to help change the future for the better. So keep up the good work. Listen to your teachers.
How am I supposed to follow that, RJ? Come on, man. Don't leave some room for me to breathe here.
Sorry.
No, everyone, thanks so much for having us. It's great that we're having this conversation. 40 years ago, it wouldn't be happening. So the fact that it's happening is part of the proof that it's starting to change. So it's a very big ship, and don't get discouraged that a large ship takes a long time to make a turn. It's okay, just keep pushing and it'll happen.
Jenni?
Yes, thank you all. It's been a great night. I'm glad you all could make it and see the film. Hopefully tell your friends, tell your neighbors. It's a movement that, this film is sort of a never-ending thing. Once we made it, we thought, we'd come out, but people are still hungry for the message because they are open to it now, and they weren't before. We were a little ahead of time, but now that it is, it's going to be up to you and the future class to keep pushing it forward, because we talked about Jerry Jewell, and I was thinking about this when she was out in the 80s. There was a push for performers with disabilities. There was a positive move, and then it faded away. And I don't want this one to fade away for any of the diverse groups that are making strides right now. And hopefully it's the future filmmakers that'll make sure it's not just a flash in the pan, a momentary time where we care about what we're producing and what we're feeding the public a constant diet of. So hopefully you guys will make the difference and carry the torch further. But thank you for being here and taking that first step.
Professor Bixby, any thoughts?
I just wanted to thank our guests. Thank you, Jenni, for an amazing film and for the work that it's doing in advancing this cause. And thanks, Kirk and RJ, for sharing your stories. I think hearing straight from you guys about your experience is really a treat, and it's something that I think we can all take a lot away from. So I really appreciate you doing that for us.
Great. Thanks again to everybody, to FilmSpark, to the Hollywood Invades Tempe crew for putting this together. It's I love it when we get to talk to professionals and bring them into conversation with our students, especially when it's a substantive topic like this. But it's a big part of what we do at the film school here, and I'm very grateful to everybody.
Hey, Jason,
submitted questions.
If you will, Jason, let me give one more shout out to Barry. Barry, who started this whole thing. Thank you so much, Barry. If you hadn't come up to me after that one event, we wouldn't be here tonight. And thank you for your perseverance in making it happen.
Yeah, I'm so appreciative of you all joining us. And yeah, everyone can now know that story, that the reason this caught fire is because I just happened to attend an event at USC that Jenni was showing this documentary. And I was just moved by it and wanted to share with everyone here. So I'm so glad to see how many faces came out today. Even Michael Scott, doctor from Rancho Los Amigos. And thank you very much. Really happy to see you.
Thanks so much. Love, wonderful conversation. I'm always so grateful to learn and hear people's experiences, and especially for something like this where it's so clear that there's so many really good stories to tell and so many new voices that can tell them. So hopefully we're just at the beginning of that conversation. So thanks everybody. You may sign off when you need to. I'm going to stay here in case my people need me. But thanks again to everybody. Be well.